So as we saw in our earlier chapter on tissue last semester, there are three different types of muscle. There's skeletal muscle, there's smooth muscle, and then there's cardiac muscle. In this chapter, we'll be focusing on the organization of skeletal muscle. And in the following chapter, we'll be addressing the physiology of muscle. So first of all, we'll take a look into the structural and functional organization of muscles. We'll look at the muscles of the head and neck, the muscles of the trunk, the muscles that act on the shoulder and upper limb, as well as the muscles acting on the hip and lower limb. Now, I recommend that you start putting together an outline in a similar way as we did for the skeletal system. There are about 600 human skeletal muscles, as opposed to the 206 bones, so we've got a lot to go on. The good news is we're not learning many features on the muscles. The muscles constitute about half of our body weight. They're specialized for one major purpose. That is, converting the chemical energy in ATP to the actual mechanical energy of motion. Myology is the study of the muscular system. The muscles have many different functions. First and most obviously, movement. We move from place to place, we move body parts and body contents. When we're breathing, we move air in and out of the lungs. We move blood through the circulatory system. We feed and digest, defecate, urinate, and even produce childbirth with the movement of muscles. Muscles also have a role in communication, because we have all these facial muscles involved in speech, our hands in writing, and then the nonverbal communications that also come from our facial communications. Stability is another role of the muscles. They maintain our posture by preventing unwanted movements. We have muscles that resist the pull of gravity and prevent us from basically falling down in a pile of bones. These muscles also stabilize the joints. There are also sphincters that control the openings of passageways. There's internal muscular rings that surround ducts like the bile duct and blood vessels and the exit to the urinary bladder as well as the rectum. The skeletal muscles also produce a lot of heat. As much as 85% of our body heat is produced by the skeletal muscles. The muscles are organized in bundles of connective tissue. This is a great picture for us to diagram. First of all, let's look at the level of the muscle fiber. Each muscle fiber is a muscle cell, and it's surrounded by a very thin, loose sleeve of connective tissue called the endomysium. Endo means inside, right? This allows room for the capillaries and nerve fibers to reach each muscle fiber. The muscle fibers are organized in bundles called fascicles. These fascicles are covered in a slightly thicker layer of connective tissue that's called the perimysium. They carry larger nerves and blood vessels, as well as some stretch receptors that we'll investigate in the next chapter. Now, the bundles of muscle fibers that are called fascicles are bundled together in another protective layer called the epimysium. Epi means outside, so the endomysium was on the inside and the epimysium is on the outside. The epimysium surrounds the entire muscle. The outer surface of the epimysium sort of combines with the next layer, which is called the fascia. And the inner surface will send projections between the fascicles. The fascia is a big sheet of connective tissue that separates neighboring muscles or muscle groups from each other. In most places, it's integrated with the epimysium. You've seen the fascia if you've ever seen like a pork tenderloin or whatever, that silver skin that you might see covering any meat that you have. Here's a micrograph of the connective tissue. We can see these long muscle fibers. So go ahead, pull out a pen and paper and put together a quick diagram of all the different connective tissue layers on muscle, including the endomysium around muscle fibers, the perimysium around bundles of muscle fibers or fascicles, and the epimysium around the whole muscle with its projections into the muscle between the fascicles, also include the fascia. Now we'll move on to look at how we classify muscles. The strength of the muscles and the direction of its pull is determined by the orientation of the fascicles in the muscle. There are fusiform muscles that we see over here on the left. They're thick in the middle, they're tapered at the end. The biceps brachii and the gastrocnemius in our calf is a great example of fusiform muscles. There are parallel muscles. An example is the rectus abdominis. They have a uniform width with parallel fascicles. They can span much longer distances than the other shapes. The rectus abdominis, again, is a great example, and the zygomaticus major. There are also triangular muscles or convergent muscles. They're fan-shaped muscles, as you can see here. They have broad origin and taper to a narrower insertion. The pectoralis major and the temporalis are perfect examples. There are pennate muscles, both unipennate, bipennate, and multipennate that we can see here. Pennate means that they insert obliquely on a tendon. It makes them have sort of a feather shape. Unipennate means it's a one-sided feather. Bipennate, the more traditional feather shape. And then multipennate would be like having a bundle of feathers held together. We see the multipennate in the deltoid muscle. And then finally, there are circular muscles, which can act as sphincters. They're rings around body openings, usually. We'll see them in the anal sphincter and the urethral sphincter, as well as around the mouth in the orbicularis ori and around the eyes in orbicularis oculi. So muscles attach to our bone in a variety of different ways. First of all, they can have indirect attachment to bone. Tendons bridge the gap between muscle ends and their bony attachments. So tendons again go from muscle to bone. The collagen fibers of the endo, peri, and epimysium are what constitute the tendon. From there, they penetrate into the periosteum and the matrix of the bone to create a very strong attachment. The biceps brachii and Achilles tendon are great examples of these indirect tendinous attachments. There are also aponeuroses. Aponeuroses are broad, flat sheets of tendon. We'll see that in the palmar aponeurosis. And there are also retinaculums. Retinaculums are a band of connective tissue that a bundle of tendons might pass under. The retinaculum acts to hold them all in place. We see one of those around the carpal tunnel in our wrist. There are also direct or fleshy attachments to bone, where there's little separation between the muscle and bone. The muscle seems to emerge directly from the bone. The margins of the brachialis and the lateral head of the triceps brachii are great examples of these direct fleshy attachments. Some skeletal muscles do not insert on bone, but in the dermis of the skin. These are the muscles of facial expression that are unique to humans. Now, when we describe muscles, we'll describe them often by their origin and their insertion. The origin is the bony attachment at the stationary end, and the insertion is the bony attachment at the more mobile end of the muscle. Usually that means at the more proximal end we have the origin, and at the more distal end we have the insertion. We can see here when we look at the biceps brachii, it has origins, a couple of different origins, because it has two bellies up in the shoulder here, and it has insertions down on the radius. We'll be learning a lot of origins and insertions as we go through our different muscles. There'll be a quick quiz on Anatomy and Physiology Revealed about origins and insertions. The effect that's produced by a muscle, whether it's used to produce or prevent a movement, is called its action. The prime mover is the agonist. It's the muscle that produces the most force during the joint action. Synergists are muscles that aid the prime mover. They could act to stabilize a nearby joint or modify the direction of movement slightly. Antagonists oppose the prime mover. They relax to give the prime mover control over an action, or they can tense up to prevent excessive movement and injury. Antagonistic pairs are muscles that act on opposite sides of a joint. An example would be the biceps and the triceps. We'll also see fixator muscles. Fixator muscles prevent the movement of a bone. For example, there'll be fixator muscles to hold the shoulder blade in place while we move our arm. Here's an example when we look at the muscle actions across the elbow. The prime mover, in this case, is the brachialis because it provides more force. The synergist would be the biceps brachii because it's helping in that same action. The antagonist would be the triceps brachii, and then the fixator, we'd see the rhomboids holding the scapula in place. In places like the tongue, the larynx, the back, the hand, and the foot, we distinguish between intrinsic muscles and extrinsic muscles. Intrinsic muscles are contained entirely within a region, such as the hand. Both the origin and the insertion are inside the hand. Here are some intrinsic muscles of the hand. Extrinsic muscles act on a designated region, but their origins are outside of that region. For example, again, in the hand, the fingers, the muscles that operate the fingers are actually up in the forearm. So we'll study some extrinsic muscles and some intrinsic muscles of the hand. The innervation of a muscle refers to the identity of the nerve that stimulates it. This enables the diagnosis of nerve, spinal cord, and brainstem injuries from their effects on muscle function. There are spinal nerves that arise from the spinal cord. They emerge through the intervertebral foramina, and they innervate all the muscles below the neck. We'll see various nerve plexuses, which are web-like networks of spinal nerves that are adjacent to the various regions of the vertebral column. You might recall some of these from first semester. As you'll also recall, arise from the base of the brain, and they emerge through the foramina, or little holes in the skull. They innervate the muscles of the head and neck. Learning all the names of these muscles might seem like a very forbidding task, especially when some of them have such long Latin names as depressor labii inferioris and flexor digiti minimi brevis. Typically, these names describe a distinctive aspect of the structure, location, or action of a muscle, and they can become very helpful once we grow familiar with a few of these Latin words. So this is where you really might come into touch with the appendix in the back of your book that gives us the lexicon of biomedical word elements. Don't let them become overwhelming. Just like in other words that we've looked at, the Latin and Greek roots, when we learn what they mean, it'll give us a lot of information about the muscles. So as you learn these different muscles, you will learn these different roots, and it'll become easier and easier to learn them. In studying the muscles, remember, you have the whole muscular system with you all the time, just like you did with the skeletal system. So be sure to palpate the muscles on yourself constantly when you have a moment to spare, and remember what the names of these muscles are. See if you can come up with their origins and insertions also. We'll have models. We don't have cadavers, but we'll look at some muscles in cats. And we have a wonderful resource on Anatomy and Physiology Revealed to get visual images of the muscle. We'll also study the origins and insertions. It helps again to look at the skeleton, so we'll spend some time with Hank when we study the origins and insertions. It's really important to say the names aloud to yourself. Again, you'll be tested on the cats by giving tours, so we'll do plenty of practice at saying the names. Also, remember your outlines. If you have your outlines, you have all the muscles essentially compartmentalized into small groups, and you recognized already how much easier that made the skeleton to learn.